The 19th century was a time of vigorous colonial expansion by the Western industrialized nations, most of them from Europe, and most of them predominantly white. As part of this process, innumerable indigenous groups were defeated and subjugated by means of military force. In most cases, the troops of the colonial power were aided in their conquests by possessing more technologically advanced weaponry, and the general public in nations such as Britain became accustomed to hearing accounts of small numbers of their well-equipped and highly disciplined soldiers overcoming vast hordes of so-called savages in exotic locales in Africa and Asia. Every so often, however, one of the native peoples managed to inflict a defeat on the Western power, an event that usually came as a shock to the would-be imperialists. The battles of the Little Bighorn, where Native Americans defeated U.S. cavalry, and Isandlwana, where Zulu warriors defeated Victorian British soldiers, could be considered prime examples of this. In these cases, however, the victory of the indigenous inhabitants was soon followed by the colonial power launching an even more massive invasion, resulting in catastrophic defeat for the natives, and usually also the destruction of their way of life and much of their culture. Throughout the 19th century, there were many colonial wars in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, and in every instance, the original occupants ultimately lost, and as a result, suffered both material and cultural devastation. Thus, from the rather self-congratulatory perspective of the Western colonial nations, occasional setbacks, such as Little Bighorn or Isandlwana, could be viewed as just temporary aberrations in the overall triumphant advance of imperialism. They were merely anomalies that were soon corrected. In the grim litany of imperialism, however, one battle stands out for having a very different end result. This is the Battle of Adwa in 1896. There, the Ethiopians beat an Italian army intent on turning their country into an overseas possession of Italy. As we've seen with the Zulus and Native Americans, such upsets could and did happen. But Adwa is anomalous for two reasons. First, the Ethiopians employed technology that was equal, or in some cases even superior, to that of the colonial power. And more importantly, their victory had permanence. It decisively ended the war, and Ethiopia gained international legitimacy and recognition as an independent African nation. It also upset racial assumptions that were widespread at the time by demonstrating that black Africans and their civilizations were not inevitably doomed to fall before European imperialism. In 1884, Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, hosted the Berlin Conference, at which the major European states had divided up nearly all of Africa into spheres of influence. And it's a telling indication of contemporary attitudes that although 14 countries were invited to participate in this conference, including the United States, not a single African state was among them. Apparently, their wishes were not considered worth hearing. Among Italy's allotted share were Eritrea and Somalia in East Africa. Sandwiched right between these was one of the few remaining independent African nations, Ethiopia. And not surprisingly, Italy coveted that country as well, and began to look around for ways to extend its dominion over it. Ethiopia was in reality composed of several kingdoms, each with its own monarch. But there was also an overall emperor, currently a man named Johannes, who ruled over all of them. In the aftermath of the Berlin Conference, there were a number of skirmishes between Ethiopia and the Italians. In 1885, the Italians encroached on Ethiopia, establishing a military outpost in what was considered Ethiopian territory. Emperor Johannes responded by sending an army, which was slaughtered by the much better equipped Italians. Even though the Ethiopians then managed to ambush an Italian column and kill 500 men, the earlier encounter had given them a false confidence that in a straight battle they could easily overcome even large numbers of Ethiopians. Ethiopian politics of this era are complicated due to both internal and external factors. In addition to Italy, there was also the external threat posed by Egypt, which had invaded Ethiopia in 1875 and seemed to have a desire to do so again. Within the country, there was strife between the northern and the southern areas of Ethiopia, and there were many power struggles over the throne among the various noble families of those regions. The Italians were able to very successfully play off these conflicts, backing one or another of these internal factions in return for expanding Italian influence and territory. One of the main contenders for power in Ethiopia was Menelik II. He was the king of the southern Shoa region, and he claimed to trace his ancestry back to the legendary figures of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Menelik was a clever and charismatic man who understood very well how to use propaganda to enhance his reputation and further his aims. One of his close associates was a Swiss engineer who not only constructed public works for him, but also acted as a kind of unofficial ambassador to Europe, as well as press agent, marketing Menelik as an enlightened ruler worthy of inclusion in the world community of leaders. In courting public opinion, it helped that Ethiopia was a Christian kingdom of great antiquity. In many respects, this strategy worked. In a series of popular postcards, Ethiopia was represented as a kind of African Switzerland, and Menelik himself was featured favorably in a cover story of Vanity Fair magazine. Another important supporter of Menelik was his wife, Tetu. She came from an influential noble family from the northern district of Ethiopia. And thus, by marrying her, Menelik gained support from an area that otherwise would have been one of his most bitter rivals. She was no passive spouse, but rather was a dynamic and strong-willed partner who took an active role in political affairs. As one scholar has noted, they were a true power couple who shared a vision for ruling Ethiopia. Menelik had given nominal submission to the current emperor Johannes. He paid him symbolic homage by appearing before the emperor carrying a rock on his neck and keeping his eyes downcast. But Menelik plainly dreamed of seizing the throne for himself. Eager to expand into Ethiopia, the Italians sought to take advantage of this internal power struggle by providing aid to Menelik. Their hope was that if he won, he would in return grant them territorial concessions and favor them in his policy. It was a dangerous game that Menelik played, treading the line between extracting as much material aid from the Italians as he could, while still trying not to compromise the future of himself and really his whole country by promising them too much. One of the main things that Menelik consistently sought to acquire in these dealings with the Italians was modern weapons. In the course of negotiations with both the Italians and others, Menelik managed to get his hands on thousands of excellent modern rifles, as well as the ammunition to go along with them. Eventually, he would also obtain cutting-edge artillery pieces. Most importantly, a substantial number of outstanding quick-firing and long-range cannons from the French armaments firm of Hotchkiss. Not only did the Ethiopians get these cannons, but they mastered the use of them, learning the specialized techniques of observing the fall of shot and then adjusting the aim. In one early battle, the barrage laid down by the Ethiopian gunners was so devastatingly accurate that while observing it, an experienced Italian artilleryman simply could not believe that the men operating the cannons were not white, exclaiming, "It's impossible that they're not European." When the current Emperor Johannes was killed while fighting the Egyptian Mahdists in 1889, Menelik's chance to seize power arrived. Aided by his modern weapons, he made himself ruler of the country. His next challenge was to reach an accommodation with his Italian backers. An Ethiopian embassy was dispatched to Rome. A treaty was signed. In it, Menelik acknowledged Italian control over Eritrea and some coastal regions, in return for Italy recognizing him as the Emperor of Ethiopia. It seemed a fairly amicable agreement that benefited both sides. But contained within this document was one section that would lead directly to war between them. In the version of the treaty written in Italian, Clause 17 stated that Menelik consents to conduct all negotiations with other powers or governments through the government of the King of Italy. Now, for all practical purposes, this wording reduced Ethiopia to the status of an Italian protectorate, which would have its foreign policy determined for it by Italy. However, in the version written in Amharic, Ethiopia's language, the same clause said that Menelik may, if he so desires, avail himself of the Italian government in all negotiations with other powers or governments. This phraseology made seeking Italian assistance optional, and it left Menelik able to conduct his own foreign policy if he chose to do so. It was a subtle difference in terminology, but an enormous disparity in meaning. Of course, the treaty was supposed to say exactly the same thing in both languages, and there is still debate today over whether or not the Italians deliberately deceived Menelik, or if it was simply a translation mistake that allowed both sides to go away thinking that the treaty meant something different. When Menelik found out about the Italian version, he was dumbfounded, and he felt betrayed. Writing to the King of Italy, he declared, "I have discovered something humiliating for my kingdom." When the Italians responded by insisting that he yield to their desires in all diplomatic matters, he was naturally enraged, and Menelik repudiated the treaty. Italy jumped on this as a pretext to conquer Ethiopia outright and turn it into another colony, and thus the war began. The Italian general tasked with invading Ethiopia was the governor of Eritrea, Oresti Baratieri. He had won several minor battles and had been hailed as a new Scipio Africanus, the Roman who had vanquished Hannibal in North Africa. Baratieri had an army of just under 20,000 men, organized into 4 brigades. 3 of these were made up of Italian troops, while 1 brigade was composed of Askari. These were native troops recruited mostly from Eritrea and serving under Italian officers. Accustomed to living in the harsh East African environment, the Askari were tough troops capable of unusually rapid marches. However, the Italians had equipped them with older model rifles that were distinctly inferior to those carried by many of Menelik's soldiers. Baratieri had 56 cannons, although again they were shorter ranged and slower firing than Menelik's fine Hotchkiss artillery. To meet the invasion, Menelik mobilized the entire country, and in a nearly unprecedented display of unity, all the regions contributed large contingents of troops. The Italians would come from the north, and starting out from his stronghold in the south, Menelik began an epic march across the length of Ethiopia to meet them, amassing soldiers as he went. Eventually, his army probably numbered around 100,000 warriors and over 40 cannon. As the 2 armies drew together, each side wanted the other to be the attacker in order to gain the advantage of defending a prepared position. And so there was a standoff. For each army, this waiting game placed great stress on the ability to keep the troops supplied with food. It began to look as if whichever side could hold out longer would prevail. The Prime Minister of Italy, Crispi, who had been one of the most aggressive voices in pushing Italy's colonial ambitions, grew increasingly frustrated with this inaction, and he dispatched a series of angry and increasingly insulting telegrams to Baratieri. Finally, he decided to have Baratieri removed from command, but he couldn't resist sending him one final provocative message in which he verged on calling him a coward. Stung by this, and with his subordinates also agitating for action, Baratieri reluctantly agreed to advance towards Menelik's army, which was encamped near the town of Adwa. As it turns out, if he had only waited just a little bit longer, Menelik would likely have had to retreat due to lack of food. Baratieri devised a plan in which 3 of the 4 brigades of the Italian army would advance during the night and take up positions along a line that was defined by 3 mountains and the 2 passes separating them. General Dabormida would take his brigade and deploy in the northern pass. General Albertone would position his men in the southern pass, and General Aramonde, with the center brigade, would array his men on the forward slope of the mountain that lay between them. Baratieri and the 4th Brigade would act as a reserve. The idea was that this forward deployment would goad Menelik into launching a frontal assault against these strong positions, from which the disciplined Italians could break the larger Ethiopian army. While perhaps not brilliant, it was at least a viable plan. But nearly everything went wrong with its execution. First of all, there appears to have been confusion over whether the Italian units were merely supposed to be moving into these positions and holding, or were expected to actively go forward from there and attack the Ethiopians. While Baratieri seems to have intended the movement as a way of provoking the Ethiopians into attacking, many men and officers later reported that they believed that they were meant to be launching the assault. Obviously, there was a failure to issue clear orders and to pass along adequate instructions to the individual groups. The only maps the Italians had were crudely drawn ones, which lacked many relevant features. And performing this complex set of maneuvers in the dark was also just asking for trouble. General Albertone's brigade, charged with occupying the southern pass, was made up of 4 battalions of Askari. He was a particularly arrogant man who brooked no dissension whatsoever from his subordinates. The leading battalion of Askari quickly reached its assigned position and halted. When Albertone arrived, he asked the officer in charge why the battalion had stopped, and he was told that they had reached their objective. Albertone, however, mistakenly believed that they had not gone far enough, and so he ordered them to continue. When his subordinate tried to discuss it with him, Albertone yelled, "Go ahead, I don't want any hesitation. You're not afraid, are you?" At this, the unfortunate man had no choice but to instruct his battalion to keep marching. By dawn, this lead battalion had actually reached the edge of Menelik's camp. The camp guards opened fire on them, and at that they finally stopped, horribly exposed and miles out of position. Rousted out of their tents by the sound of gunfire, the Ethiopians attacked in waves that steadily grew larger as more and more joined in. The Italians inflicted heavy casualties, but they really stood little chance. Soon, those high-quality rifles of the Ethiopians were joined by their cannon, and the situation of this detached battalion became even more perilous. The other 3 battalions of Albertone's brigade were drawn into the conflict, but they were a long 4 miles forward from where Baratieri had intended them to be, and thus they were unable to get support from the rest of the army. When this misdeployment became apparent to Baratieri, he had no choice but to try and assist Albertone's stranded brigade. He therefore ordered Dabormida in the northern pass to take his brigade forward and to deploy slightly behind and to the side of Albertone, thus hopefully linking them together in a defensive line. Dabormida moved out, but when he came to a fork in the road, instead of following the southern path, he inexplicably went north instead of south. Now, if nothing else, the clearly audible sounds of the raging battle to the south should have indicated which road to take. But Dabormida serenely proceeded down the wrong road, leading him away from the action. Menelik now saw a golden opportunity to split the Italian army and destroy it piecemeal. And so he drove a large force of his men into the yawning gap between Albertone's and Dabormida's brigades. This isolated both of them, and Albertone's group, which by now was nearly surrounded, was lashed by gunfire. It was more than they could take, and the brigade broke. Individuals and little knots of men scattered over the hills, attempting to flee back towards the rest of the army. By now, the center brigades were also each under assault, and the reserves were committed to try and shore up the crumbling situation. With most of the Italians caught out of position, the Ethiopians were able to occupy stretches of high ground and pour fire down upon them. The Italian officers, clearly distinguishable by bright sashes across their chests, made particularly fine targets for the Ethiopian marksmen. Out of 610 Italian officers in the army, 352 became casualties. Dabormida's isolated northern battalion had set itself up in a steep valley, and having removed itself from the key zone of the battle, was relatively ignored by the Ethiopians for a while. But now they too came under attack. By mid-afternoon, each of the Italian brigades had been shattered, and the survivors were fleeing backwards. It was a complete victory for the Ethiopians. The number of Italians killed is estimated to have been around 5,000, with thousands more injured. the number of Ethiopian casualties was probably slightly greater. An additional 3,400 Italian soldiers were captured by the Ethiopians. Two post-battle episodes became controversial. First of all, while the Italian prisoners were treated quite well and eventually ransomed, the Askaris were viewed as traitors who had betrayed their homeland. Therefore, as punishment, as many as 1,500 Askari had their right hands and left feet amputated. Second, in keeping with a local custom of trophy taking, some of the Italian dead, and apparently even some wounded men, were castrated on the battlefield. This act would understandably provoke condemnation, particularly from European nations. Despite these controversies, the victory at Adwa ended the current Italian campaign to annex Ethiopia, and the country gained international recognition. Menelik ruled until his death in 1913, although in his last years, debilitating illness left Tetu mostly running things. General Baratieri escaped and was court-martialed. Although he was acquitted, his military career was over, and he went quietly into retirement. The Italians made a number of fundamental errors that resulted in their defeat at Adwa. Taking a big picture view, one could argue that the whole effort to transform Ethiopia into an Italian colony was ill-conceived from the start. Ethiopia did not offer lucrative exports of raw materials or agricultural products, and so its conquest just didn't make a lot of economic sense. Italian colonialism in East Africa seems to have been driven more by the desire on the part of some Italian politicians to gain prestige for their country. Prime Minister Crispi, in particular, appears to have suffered from a strong case of colony envy, and he wished to gain recognition for Italy as one of the big players on the international stage. Not only was Crispi's overall policy flawed, but he committed another error when he interfered in military affairs by goading the commander on the spot, Baratieri, into launching an offensive against his better judgment. As for the attack itself, well, it suffered from problems at every level. Its purpose was unclear, with both officers and men uncertain whether they were actually intended to assault the Ethiopian positions or instead advance and try to provoke an attack from them. The failure to issue clear orders was exacerbated by the behavior and attitudes of the various generals in charge of the main brigades. Not only were they touchy and arrogant, but they were also in disagreement over strategy. And so they utterly failed to cooperate or even really to communicate with one another. The maps being used were of poor quality, the terrain was insufficiently scouted. Albertoni's foolish thrust far beyond the line that Baratieri intended him to advance to displayed either amazing incompetence or insubordination, or maybe both. In any event, it alone may have doomed the entire Italian side. Dolomida's blunder in taking the wrong road and then stubbornly refusing to correct the error then sealed their fate. Overconfidence, lack of clarity, pig-headedness, miscalculation, and just plain stupidity were all amply displayed by the Italians at Adwa, and the net result was one of the greatest victories of an indigenous people over an imperial power during the whole era of colonization. As noted at the beginning of this lecture, it was also a rarity in that the native civilization was not crushed soon afterwards in a follow-up campaign, but instead established itself as an independent nation. 40 years later, fascist Italy, under the leadership of Mussolini, would take another stab at conquering Ethiopia. Employing armored vehicles, aircraft, and even poison gas, This time, they did defeat the Ethiopian forces and occupy the country. It was a short-lived success, however, and within a few years, aided by the British, rebels, including Haile Selassie, had retaken the country. Selassie, the son of one of the most prominent Ethiopian leaders and generals at Adwa, would go on to rule Ethiopia as its emperor until the 1970s.